Welcome back, everybody, to another casual conversation. I'm your host, John Malanca. We have Dr. Jordan Tishler, Dr. Adam Abodeely, Dr. Sandra Carrillo, and a new guest to our not only team but our podcast, Christine Goedhart, and she is education chair of education department for the Association of Cannabinoid Specialists. So, welcome. Thank you for joining us, and excited to hear all that you've been doing for us so far, and what we have in store for the future. So. If you want to introduce yourself, please do.
Yeah, I'm excited to be part of the Association of Cannabinoid Specialists, and especially with this topic of evaluating scientific research. It's really fascinating. So excited to talk about it.
It's needed. There's so much information out there, when we work with patients and families, et cetera, the one thing when someone's diagnosed with something as scary as you've got this or I'll use cancer, there's so many things, and where do you go? And I call it panic education mode, when that happens. And so maybe you can still some light for us as well as our listeners of what how you handle this and what you're working on.
Yeah, so I mean, the thing is with scientific research, it's very tricky with cannabis. You have to be such a conscious consumer, a discerning consumer of the information that you're taking in. And especially with cannabis research, it can be really tricky. There's great research out there. There's not so great research out there. So a couple just real quick tips that I might put out, first of all, is always start off from a place of skepticism. Really go in expecting that that source or that study is going to need to convince you rather than you giving it the benefit of the doubt. Another tip that I might add is to be aware of your own biases and assumptions going in. I mean, we all hold biases, assumptions based on our prior knowledge and experiences. This is normal. We all have them. They're not necessarily bad. They help us navigate the world and help us make decisions, but they can really get in the way of helping us to properly evaluate new information and science. So being aware of them can help you better overcome any impact that they might have on your evaluation process. And something I would say is a really good signal of your biases is your emotions. So do a quick emotional scan. Really ask yourself, does this research claim make me feel excited? Does it make me feel angry? That's going to be a signal for some bias that you might hold. So just keep that in mind and try to stay as neutral as possible about the validity of any source before you look at it more closely. And whenever possible, try to get that entire research article. Read it from the very top to the very end. As you do, watch out for common red flags. And we can talk about those common red flags if you want. But also, don't be swayed by any one study. Really consider it within the larger context of available research. And keep practicing. So
You
those
know,
are some major tips I have.
I'm always up for those red flags. What red flags can you share with our audience?
Yeah, well, in reference to scientific
And
articles.
research, as you're saying, research,
Yeah.
the studies, um,
Yeah.
and what can you share with that?
Yeah, so look out for flaws in experimental design. So inadequate blinding or masking, that's going to indicate there might be some bias there. Lack of appropriate controls, failure to account for confounding variables, having really small sample sizes. Those are things to watch out for. Watch out for assuming causation when only association has been found. This is unfortunately very, very common. Be especially careful of this when reviewing observational studies, such as case control, cohort studies. These studies really can't show evidence of causation. That can only be done by randomized controlled trials. And even then, you want to see it replicated multiple times, not just in one randomized controlled trial. Watch out for inappropriate extrapolation of results. So from mice to humans, that often doesn't translate well, or generalizing conclusions to a larger population when the study was done using a very specific homogeneous sample. And then, of course, always look for funding sources, affiliations of
Well
authors to see
said.
if there's any evidence of conflict of interest. So those are some key aspects with research studies. When I see a headline, I'm always very skeptical about it. And so I need to go to the actual source and see what that is saying.
Gotcha. Where are you based out of?
Well, I'm based out of the University of British Columbia.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm a science education specialist there.
Jordan, do you have any questions?
Well, I encountered a great example just this morning. There is a study in my area of research, which is sexuality, and one of my colleagues and I are in the middle of doing a, systematic review of the literature around cannabis use for female orgasm difficulties. And she got very, very excited because recently there was published a randomized controlled trial. Um, and uh, and that sounds great. But when you actually read the methodology, there really wasn't a control group. Not only that, but there wasn't even a clear intervention because the control group were these were all women who had breast cancer, and the control group was standard of care, usual care, right? So there was no sham intervention. And then the intervention group was the insertion of a cannabis suppository into the vagina. Um, but some of the people used commercially available products, some of them used homemade products. In no cases were these women given the specific product. So not only did they know that they were getting an active agent, there was no blinding to that, but then who knows what was actually in that active agent. And so, yes, technically they were randomized into each arm of the study, but really it wasn't, and there was a control group, but it wasn't an appropriate control group, as Christine was saying, and there was no real control over the interventions either. So in many ways, I was pointing out to Suzanne that, it sounds good that they said, well, we did a randomized control study, but they didn't really randomize or control properly. And so in the end, it really came down to a bunch of women who had significant illness using something and reporting that they felt better, which really is an observational study, not a randomized controlled trial. So again, we see that people, not surprisingly, if they look at a primary science article, often will read the abstract. And I do that too. I read the abstract. But if there's anything in there that either interests me or makes me concerned, then you got to go right down to the materials and methods and see how did they actually do this, because what they wrote in the abstract or what they write in the discussion and conclusion may not really be supported by what they actually did, because that's their bias, which is what we're finding.
Another thing that I'm always particularly cognizant of too, we've probably all read articles, and oftentimes, particularly in the introduction, there can be a general tone of the article itself, and sometimes that's a red flag that I've noticed over the years. Typically, if an introduction is very, let's say in the case of cannabis, if it was very, if the outcomes of the paper were towards a negative outcome, oftentimes sometimes you can get the sense of that just by reading the introduction and the general tone of the authors, and you almost get some general perceptions of the way that they believe cannabis in this case, might be perceived, or the general outcomes. And that's one thing. The other thing, as you pointed to, is I am in the habit now of looking at who wrote it, who sponsored it, and things. The challenge for me is always then trying to determine, well, does that necessarily, how do we pick out bias, from that? I mean, I think it's safe to say that even if something was done in a big academic, prestigious university, there still could be a tremendous amount of bias in it. But certainly, and on the flip side of the coin, we might tend to think that something might steer more towards having a bias if it's sponsored by a drug company, a pharmaceutical company, or another third party. So, I'm wondering if anybody has any comments about that, in general, when we look at these, like the setting the tone side apart, but just going back to looking at who wrote the article. Are there any other things that we might be able to, to comment on that might give us a little more insight, into that? I mean, sometimes, we see authors that it's a multi-center trial, and I like to think that maybe that leans a little less towards bias, because hopefully everybody comes with their own, thoughts I think everybody that does a research study has an idea of what the outcomes, might end up being. But well, having said that, what do we think about that?
I totally agree with you. I have, if you've been around in this field, as in I'm sure any field, you start to realize who are the players, right? And what are their biases, or what have they studied before? There's a particular psychiatrist at Yale who I won't call out, but early on realized that he just doesn't believe cannabis is good for anything, and so all of his studies are universally negative. And at some point you just have to sort of discount that. Um, Back to your point about the tone, if I had a nickel for every article that started with marijuana is the most commonly used illicit substance in the world, right? I mean, you just know from that statement where we're going, right? Or sometimes it doesn't say illicit, it says abused. And you're like, okay, I know where this is going, right?
Right. Yeah. So those tones I've certainly recognized over the years as being an important indicator. Yep.
Yes, I actually I couldn't agree more with you and with Jordan too, because definitely you will know where to start when you read the first phrases when they're using these names, marijuana, addictions, and all these things. So then you have a pretty good idea. But what concerns me more is, as physicians, as doctors, I see a lack of training in how to read papers and what to look for, as Christine was saying, how to look for red flags. Because I've talked to a lot of colleagues that when they want to write a paper, or when they want to do a case control, or publish something, they don't even know where to start. So if they don't know how to write it, they don't know how to read it. So it is concerning, because there is very little training in medical school, in pre-medical school, and how to assess these journals, these publications. So when the people graduate, they're ill-equipped in how to judge if this is like the sample is the appropriate number, the sample, if the randomization is the real randomization, if it's a real placebo or not. So I think we should even start from medical school and from the graduation of the health care professionals, because there's a lot of people, and we saw this in the pandemics, that they were doing these claims and these false claims all over about cannabinoids curing COVID. And I was seeing a lot of colleagues super excited, and then I was saying, okay, this is a preprint. And they didn't even know what a preprint is. And I'm like, okay, you are excited about a preprint, and then peer reviewed, and all these things that of course, when you get to as I assume all of us here, we have to read so much material in order to be able to learn and understand. So you get that taste of that understanding that there is a lot of misinformation, a lot of biases, and a lot of journals that nobody know where they came from, that they're publishing anything just because they're getting paid. So it is a wild west, and sometimes sometimes the journals with very high reputations already have some bias with this, and sometimes you apply to publish, and I don't want to say names, and immediately because it's cannabinoids, they say no, we're not accepting this subject right now. So I think the bias is just like back and forward in here, but I appreciate the fact that in the ACS with Christine, we will increasing this knowledge and spreading this knowledge so our colleagues, the healthcare professionals, will know how to pick the information and highlight the red flags and be able to take advantage of all the amazing information that is there, but also discard the bad information. So that's my little commentaries here.
Yeah, thank you. And I just want to jump on that with really probably the most important tip that I give people is to have a trusted anchor source to go to when you're unsure, because we can't be experts in everything. And oftentimes we'll come across an article and we don't know if it's good or not. So it can be really helpful to have an anchor source, especially if you're not familiar with a given field. This could be an expert that's proven their credibility that you trust. It could be a reputable organization like the Association of Cannabinoid Specialists. And just to plug some of the resources that the ACS has to really help you evaluate and determine the scientific credibility of a source or a study having to do with cannabis. There's the clinical reference library that gives you, an overview of the field that helps you to kind of see, okay, is what I'm looking at far off from what we know to be, to be credible, or is it, aligned with what we know? There's the casual conversations videos like we're doing today. There's the advocacy position papers and guidance that's available on the website, the Doc Talk blog series. So there's a lot of resources and references that can help you to better navigate and triangulate if something is credible.
And do not forget, we have accredited courses as well for our medical specialists. So a lot going on here at the Association of Cannabinoid Specialists, and we're honored to have you part of the team. And in closing, anybody else want to close, or are we good here?
I would just throw in that if anybody is looking at a study and they want a second opinion, they can always email us. We'll be happy to get back to them.
Please do. Well said, Jordan. Well said. So, Christine, thank you very much, and thank you for my fellow colleagues here. And we will see you at our next session at the Casual Conversation with Association of Cannabinoid Specialists. Have a good evening, everyone. Bye-bye.